Good morning, everyone. So there's several organizations in our country that survey and try to find out the state of the American church. The Barna organization is one of them. Pew Research does a lot on this, and Lifeway Christian bookstores, they have a research wing that does a lot of this, and they track what the numbers are in the church. So I read some statistics recently that said that in America, 63% of Americans self-identify as Christians. Now, that's down from 90-something% in the early 90s, which is statistically significant. That's a huge drop, and as they survey, they have different religions that you might belong to, and the very last one they put is none. And one of the headlines was the fastest growing religion in the United States is none. The nones are growing exponentially, and what the research bears out is that the younger you are, the more likely you are to fit into the category of the nones or the unaffiliateds. And that's a significant thing, and I think we can see that playing out across our country. And, you know, it makes this situation that we're in right now, that the churches in all of the United States are made up of mostly baby boomer generation, with some Gen Xers, like me. Baby boom would be roughly 60 and above. And the Gen X is, I don't know, less than that. Younger than that. In the millennial generation and the Generation Z, which is below the millennial generation, those are the less likely people to be in church. And that is, you know, I'm not trying to be negative when I say that. I'm just trying to report the news. That is statistically true, and we're seeing it play out in our own community. I was talking to someone yesterday from another church who said that the thing they don't like about their church is there's no young people that go to their church. And in so many churches you walk into across our country, no matter what the denomination is, that is becoming more and more true. And that's the situation that we're in. And so I want to say, from a kind of focus on health and not pathology wise, if you're under 40 and you're in this church, we honor you. We are so glad that you're here. We want you to feel seen and heard and welcome and a part of the culture of this church. It is so important for us to be a multi-generational church. And I think part of it is why studying the Sermon on the Mount is so important. Because in the Sermon on the Mount, what you have is Jesus going back to these first principles, the basis of this new thing that he's trying to do. He gives us the core message of this new thing he's trying out in the world, and it's actually his longest sermon that's recorded in Scripture. And it's early on in his ministry, so he's trying to get them to have a mindset switch from the way they used to think about things to this new way of thinking about things. And it's the heart of what the change that Jesus represents. And we know it's a change. You can hear just in what Kevin did in communion today, you can feel that change that's coming. Like if you got excited about the murder stuff at the beginning, I got bad news for you. That changes with Jesus. Like there's a mindset change where you no longer hate your enemies, you love your enemies. And more on that later. So you can tell this new thing that Jesus is doing by the way he gets into each and every topic. And if we were spending 6 months and not 6 weeks on the Sermon on the Mount, we could go through topic by topic and talk about how there's this new thing he's trying to do. But just in Matthew 5, you see the start of the new thing. You see him starting to explain himself, and he explains it really well in verse 20 when he says, "For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. So he's talking about, excuse me, a new kind of righteousness, a righteousness apart from the law, a righteousness that surpasses the people who are teaching the law and the prophets and what's going on at this time, that there's something greater and better than that coming. And so he starts off with saying, hey, this thing I'm telling you surpasses that old thing that you heard. And then he continues on, and he gets in this cycle of, you have heard this, but I tell you this. This is the old way of thinking, but now here's the new way of thinking about this. And it's a change in heart and motivation. So in verses 21 and 22, he puts it this way. You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you the truth, that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. So he goes from don't murder to don't be angry. And then the rest of this verse, you can see that Jesus is really serious about this one. And so it's a change in mindset and in motivation. You've heard it was said don't murder, but I tell you, deal with your anger. Again, in Matthew 5, 27 and 28, he says it this way, you have heard it was said, you should not commit adultery. But I tell you, anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Again, you see this new thing. The first thing is based on behavior. This is what you heard not to do. But I'm not trying to, Jesus is saying, I'm not trying to change your behavior. I'm trying to change your heart. And in your heart, get rid of the anger. If you get rid of the anger, you don't have to worry about the other stuff. If you get rid of the hatred, you don't have to worry about the other stuff. If you get rid of the lust, you don't have to worry about the adultery stuff. And so this mindset, this heart change that he's going for. You see it again in verses 33 and 34. He said, again, you have heard that it was said to people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven or God's throne. And these are just a few of them that you find in Matthew 5, where he starts out with speaking something that they're familiar with, either a law that they've heard or a tradition that they had, and said, you've heard this said, but then here's this new thing, and it's different from the old thing. And it really is, if you look at them all together, and these are just a few of them, if you look at them all together, what you will see is he is changing from this idea of the behaviors that you have. This is the law. These are the things to do and not to do. And he's changing more to the idea of the heart that you have. He starts off with this talking about, here's what you do. And he goes more towards, this is why I want you to do. This is who you're to be. And I think what he's saying is these behaviors that people struggle with and don't struggle with will take care of themselves if you have the right kind of heart. If you show you have the right kind of heart. Now, if you're a parent, you get this progression, right? When your child is, 1, 2, 3 years old and they're acting up, usually you typically say, just stop doing that. Whatever that behavior is right now, it's not working. Stop doing it. But at some point, they're old enough that that's not good enough anymore. And at some point, you begin to reason, give them the reason, give them the why behind, what they're doing is not working. And you start to have this conversation with them about what they're thinking and what their motivations are. And eventually, what you want to do is by the time they're an adult, that you're not saying, don't do that anymore. You're starting to say, okay, let's think through these conversations and these decisions. And the conversation changes as you mature. And I think it's the same way when God is interacting with faith. He's saying, as this idea of how mankind interacts with God, then how you do this changes, and it becomes more about the heart. And if it's about the heart, then the behaviors will take care of themselves. Now, this style is called for lack of a better term, deconstruction. That he's taking this set of beliefs and mindsets that they have, and he's tearing them down. You've heard it this way. And then he's building them back up, something more substantial, something more prominent in the way he's trying to teach it. So it's a deconstruction, reconstruction. And I use that terminology because if you've heard what young people are doing in Christianity, and as they come to terms moving from an inherited faith to an owned faith, a lot of them will call it deconstruction. I'm deconstructing these old ways of thinking, and I'm trying to build something new. And I think Jesus would say, essentially, that's a good thing. That's a good thing. Now, I have to tell you, in our society, I'm a little more uncomfortable with it because some of it has become commodified and marketed, and this idea of deconstruction becomes a way for people to make money on people's faith struggles. And so I struggle with it a little bit, but essentially, all of us go through it. If you grew up in church at all, you went through this point where you went from an inherited faith, which your parents told you to believe, to an owned faith. And part of that starts with tearing down the things that you believe that may not have been as accurate or as close to Scripture. And that's a positive thing, and Jesus kind of gives us permission to do that in these passages. It's okay to say, you've heard this, but Jesus says it like this, and it may be a little different than what you've heard. And so you see that prominently in the passages that Ingrid read earlier. And these are rich passages, and there's so much to discuss on them, and there's no way I can get to all of it. But I just want to go through them again so we can concentrate on exactly what Jesus was trying to teach them and what Jesus is trying to teach us. So this is 38 through 42. He says, "You have heard it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you." Now, there's a lot in there, and a lot of it goes against what our natural tendencies are. So he started saying, "You've heard, do this, but I tell you, do this." And then the first example he uses is if someone smacks you, turn the other cheek and let them do it again. Like, that seems so unnatural to us. That seems so unnatural to us. You know, when I grew up in the 80s, and the 80s were wild. I know when you go to school now, you don't see a lot of fights, but when I was growing up, there were always fights in school, especially somewhere between 6th and 8th grade. I had a PE teacher. I'm not making this up. His name was Mr. Kelly. I hope he's listening online because this is crazy. He was a PE teacher. He thought it was his job, if 2 guys got in a fight in PE, his job was to keep everyone else out of the fight and let them just fight it out. You'd get arrested for that now. There's no way that was okay, but that tells you kind of the culture I grew up in. And so this idea of if someone hits you, turn the other cheek and let them hit you again, that's not the way we thought. We thought if someone hits you, you hit them again, you hit them back, right? It's unnatural. It's, dare I say, upside down to think this way. But what you have to understand is all of this, all 3 of these examples he's used, and I've preached on this before, so I won't go as deep into it as I've gone before. But all 3 of these examples he used are in the context of the relationship between the Roman people and the Jewish people. The Jewish people were an occupied country. They were being oppressed by the Roman forces. And most likely the scenario he's talking about in this point is if a Roman soldier hits you, then you turn the other cheek. And I love it. I love the strength in it. Because when you boil it down, I grew up thinking this was a very weak position, that the turn the other cheek is a weak thing. And I know, I read a report out of the Southern Baptist Convention where ministers were being told by their members, "Why are you teaching us this weak theology of turning the other cheek?" Like, it comes across that way until you realize how much strength it takes because he's not fighting back. He's not backing down, but he's standing there and saying, do your worst. Like there's an amazing amount of strength that it takes to say, I am not going to retaliate and I am not going to run away from you. I am going to stand there and say, and take it. And it's such a reversal of thinking about when we feel abused or disregarded or in some way mistreated, to think that it's not my job to get vengeance or justice or anything else. God is in charge of all of that. And so one of my first mentors, Larry Chenard, said it this way in something he wrote. He said, turning the other cheek stands in deliberate tension with the way one normally thinks and lives. It illustrates a powerful principle that must be taken seriously when we encounter similar situations. Even if we are wrongfully treated, our course of action must always be governed by higher principles of the kingdom, not the mere satisfaction of our personal rights. This is upside down to the way we're thinking, but what Jesus is saying is that in most cases, the justice of God is something we can pursue, but it's not something we take for ourselves. And there's something else going on there. The second example is a legal action. You know, if someone's taking part of your clothes, give them the rest of your clothes. It's that same thing. I'm not backing down, but I'm not fighting back. That I found this third way that is the way of Jesus and the strength. The same with the extra mile. There's in this society they were in, they had a rule, a law, where if a Roman soldier gets tired of carrying his equipment, he could just find a citizen who was not a Roman soldier or a Roman citizen at all, just a citizen of an occupied territory, and make them carry his stuff for a mile. But he couldn't make them carry it 2 miles. There was just a set distance that they were allowed to carry it. And there's actually an example of this in Scripture when Jesus falls under the weight of the cross. The Roman soldiers go, I'm not carrying the cross up there. So he pulls someone out of the crowd to carry the cross to the rest of the way. Now, this was a part of Roman law, and it was this benefit that soldiers got. And there was a tendency for the people who were in the occupied territory to say, I don't want to do that. I'm not going to do that. And Jesus was saying, not only carry the mile, keep going. Keep going, because when they kept going that extra mile, they put the Roman soldier in an awkward position. If they decided not to carry the stuff, they're breaking the law. But if they go further than that 1 mile, the Roman soldier is breaking the law. And so it's this way of not backing down and not fighting back. It's this third way of Jesus that's rooted in love. And I want to tell you something. This new thing that he did, actually, if it's properly implemented by people of faith, or even sometimes people who don't have faith, it literally changes the world. It is a world-changing idea. Gandhi, the activist in India, picked up on this quickly. This is a quote from Gandhi, who was not even a Christian. He said, to me, the message of the Sermon on the Mount was a message of nonviolence, which is not just passive resistance, but active love for one's oppressors. Here's someone who wasn't even a Christian, who rejected Christianity, but found something in the way that Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount, and he was able to follow that and literally change the culture of our nation. In our nation, it was Martin Luther King Jr. He said this about it. He said, I've always felt that the Sermon on the Mount was one of the greatest expressions of the law of love ever uttered. It's the way to love even your enemies, to love those who persecute you. It is the way to live in peace. This message of nonviolent resistance, of this third way of Jesus, when properly applied, really does change things. It changed 2 different countries based on some of the leaders properly applying that. And so when we read this, we can't disregard it, because we've seen how much it works. And we've seen it work in our personal lives. Those times when someone is angry at us, or or whatever, if we can find a way to not hate but love them and not have to take retaliation, then that gives us a strength of character and a Christian witness to those people. Now, the interesting thing about it is, when he goes into this, these examples are still behaviors. And so he doesn't do what he does in some of the other ones, which is say, quit doing this behavior, but go to the heart of it. And so in the next passage that Ingrid read, you get to the heart of what he's trying to say. Gets beyond the behaviors and goes to the heart. This is Matthew 5:43 through 47. He says, "You've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good. He sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even the pagans do that?" So he goes, the heart of this matter is love. Love your enemy. Love people who persecute you. When I was in college, I would take classes sometimes in the summertime at Lake Sumter Community College just to either make up for a class that I dropped or try to get ahead on the next semester. And so I was taking a philosophy class, and the teacher there was not only not a Christian, he was aggressively not a Christian. And I was taking this philosophy class just because I thought it was a class I could get out of the way and not have to take and spend more money at it at Freed-Hardeman. And so I remember how aggressively not Christian he was. And it's the first time I'd grown up in a pretty cloistered environment. I went to a Christian school. I went to a Christian college. So this is the first time I'd ever heard a teacher or professor use profanity in class. And so it was just a new thing. And so when he was talking about philosophy, I thought it was interesting because when he got to Jesus, I thought he would handle Jesus pretty roughly. And instead, he started talking about how the philosophy of Jesus was new and something different than any philosopher had ever taught before. And when he illuminated what that was different, it was love your enemies. He said a lot of philosophers had talked about a lot of things, but Jesus is the first philosopher that ever said, love your enemies and pray for them. And that was his contribution, according to this professor, to the world of philosophy. Now, I, of course, think Jesus made a lot more contributions than that. But it's interesting to me that even someone who's not a Christian picked up on how profound and how upside down this is. Jesus starts out with this idea of quoting a law. You've heard, love your neighbor. That's the part of it that's the law. The next part of it was more tradition, not a part of the law, but hate your enemy. Now, again, what love your neighbor had become to those in Israel at that time was, that means love only the people from Israel. That's the love your neighbor part, and you can hate everyone else. You can hate your enemies. And Jesus makes the switch of love your neighbor and your enemy. And so the next logical step for them then is to discern who is your enemy. And I think that's a question for all of us, right? Who is our enemy? Who is our enemy? Are the Russians our enemy? Ukraine? China? Who is our enemy? Is it someone who has different political views than us? Are they our enemy? Is it someone who fired you? Is it someone who was mean to you? Is it someone who cut you off in traffic? Is it someone who argued with you on social media? Who is our enemy? I've been to churches where people in one part of the church thought someone else in the other part of the church was their enemy. And it was chaos, and it was over some sort of, the church used to do it this way, but now they're doing it this way, and everybody's arguing over it. Who is our enemy? And if we define our enemy, what are we supposed to do? What are we supposed to do? How do we love our enemy? How do we love the people who don't like us? I've always struggled with this. I think everybody does. I think it's part of human nature to struggle with this, right? When I was in the 6th grade, there was a bully in my class named Don Shetler. And he was mean to me almost every day. He was mean to several of my friends. He and his friends were rude and even tried to physically intimidate us. And I was trying to struggle what to do. You know, I consider myself a Christian, and I can remember complaining about it at the dinner table, and my dad saying, well, I tell you what, the next time he says something, I want you to ball up your fist, and I want you to punch him in the face as hard as you can, and then see if he keeps saying it. And I was like, yes. Yes, finally. And so went to bed that night, and I was playing it out in my head, and my dad woke me up the next morning, and he was like, hey, that advice I gave you at the dinner table last night, that probably wasn't really good advice. We're supposed to turn the other cheek and not get in fights at school, and just forget I said all of that, and then walked out of my room, and I was like, Mom got to him. Mom got to him. This doesn't come naturally. It doesn't come naturally to love your enemies. And I don't always know how to do it myself. I had a mentor in Memphis who's very dear to me. He was my first spiritual director. And I was struggling with this very thing. And I went to him and said, I'm struggling with forgiveness. There's some people that I think have mistreated me. And I walk into church and I feel like, they have a problem with me and I don't know exactly what to do. And he said something that I wish he'd never said because now I can't get it out of my head. He said, it happens to me all the time. And so the thing that I tell myself is just because someone has a problem with me doesn't mean I have to have a problem with them. Man, I wish he hadn't said that. Because now that's the first thing I think of. Just because someone has a problem with me doesn't mean I have to have a problem with them. And the more I think about it, and the more I try to implement it in my own heart, the more I realize that that's the stuff of Jesus. That we're seeking to be different. And if we're not different from how the rest of the world interacts with these things, then what advantage is it to be a Christian? What about it would attract other people to be a Christian? That there's this new thing that Jesus is doing in the world, and if we can capture it, it would be very attractive to those who are sick of a caustic and brutal world. It needs to be different when you come into here. And I don't know, I don't have all the answers, obviously, but I want to give you 2 words this morning that I think are important when we talk about this idea of loving our enemies and praying for them. And the first one is forgiveness. I think part of the thing we have to do, even when people don't ask for it, is to find forgiveness in our heart for the people who have wronged us. I love Anne Lamott. She's one of my favorite Christian writers. And someone sent me a quote this week. It says, if you're like me, blame and regret keep popping up. My shortage of forgiveness, mostly towards myself, but also to whoever I feel injured by, can be a real obstacle on my spiritual path, to say of nothing of ruining my day. But forgiveness is our work on the earth. And then she said this, I think the earth is forgiveness school. I think it's why we are here. I love that. I think the earth is forgiveness school. That's what we're being taught day in and day out. And so I think the first word we interact with is forgiveness. I think the second word we interact with is kindness. Because it's hard to know how to love everybody, but I do think the rest of the world will experience our kindness as love. And kindness costs us nothing. It costs us nothing. And when we are unkind, and we claim to be a Christian, then it speaks to the world. I'm going to share another Gandhi quote and another Martin Luther King Jr. quote. The Gandhi quote is this. He said, "I've learned from Jesus Christ that the law of love is the supreme law, but I find that Christians do not practice it in their lives. This is why I'm so disappointed with the Christians I meet. They profess one thing, but they do another." The Martin Luther King Jr. quote. Here it is. "I am convinced that the law of love is the power to transform and heal. It is the greatest force in the world, and it is the foundation of the Sermon on the Mount. But so many Christians who do not live according to its principle, and it is a tragic thing." So when I read the statistics about what's going on and why people are leaving the church, I tried to find out why. Here are the reasons that they're giving. And there's a lot of reasons, and some of them are research-based, and some of them are anecdotal. And there's stuff you'd expect, like judgmental or hypocrisy, or when my family was going through something and the church didn't support us, or the church that I grew up in didn't know how to handle my doubts. And a lot of other reasons, and almost all of them, not all of them, but almost all of them have something to do with I experienced a church setting and it was the opposite of love, or I felt the opposite of love. This morning at 5:30 in the morning, I got a message from one of my cousins. It's a cousin that I'm super close to, but he walked away from church. I don't know why he was sending me messages at 5:30 on a Sunday morning. And he had no idea. I mean, I've had this sermon mostly written for a couple weeks now. He had no idea what I was preaching on this morning. And it was a post that he had read, found on Instagram, that explained why he had walked away from church. And it was this thing. I don't want to share the whole post with you, but it was essentially that it was hate that put Jesus on the cross. And when Christians participate in the same kind of hate, it makes people not want to go to church. And it was, this is the reason, this is his part now. This is the reason I walked away from church. And being the compassionate cousin that I am, I texted back, "Why are you texting me at 5:30 on a Sunday morning? If you're not going to church, the advantage is getting to sleep in. Like, what are you doing?" But this is not hypothetical. It's not hypothetical for me. And for any of us who've had family members who've walked away, it's not hypothetical for them. And I don't know the answer, all the answers, but I do know that this is a loving church. Baby Callan went home this week while we were gone on vacation. And so we knew we were going to miss their leaving and miss last Sunday when that Cameron brought Callan in. But so we had them over to dinner. And one of the things they said is, "I can't believe what a loving church you have." And, I think that, but it feels good to get that from someone else. It's the same. While I was on vacation last week, B. McLean passed away. She's a longtime member of our church. A lot of you knew her. Most of her family doesn't come to church, but I've been interacting with her family just to set up the memorial service and get everything set. And one of her grandsons said to me, "I'm just so happy with how much your church loved my grandmother." And I think it's that. I think that's the thing that's going to be most attractive to the rest of the world. If we can live into the love of Jesus that's different, if we can treat people differently than the rest of the world treats them, then they too might find something new. Let's pray. Father, thank you for the way you love us and the way you have saved us. And Father, I pray that we live into that salvation with forgiveness and kindness and a love for everyone. It's in your Son's name I pray. Amen. This next part we're going to do this morning is one of the most important things we do. It's a time of prayer. We're going to have shepherding couples at the fringes of our auditorium. And as the rest of us stand and sing, if you have any kind of prayer request whatsoever, you can go with them and pray. If you want to pray with someone else in the room, go pray with them. It is a time of prayer, and the rest of us will stand together and worship God.